I'm telling you right now, the worst mistake you can make in life is thinking family means loyalty. Because when I handed my parents those keys to that $500,000 lake house last Thanksgiving, wrapped in a custom Tiffany box with a red bow the size of a basketball, I genuinely believed I was giving them heaven on earth. But heaven, as it turns out, has a nasty habit of turning into hell when greed walks through the front door wearing a designer suit and a smile that could charm the devil himself. My name is Ileana Mercado, and I'm a 42-year-old tech consultant who clawed her way from a two-bedroom apartment in Queens to a penthouse in Manhattan that cost more per month than most people make in a year. I earned every damn dollar through late nights, missed holidays, and sacrificing relationships that might have actually meant something if I'd given them half the attention I gave my career. My parents, Ricardo and Elena Mercado, spent their entire lives working themselves to the bone so my brother Dante and I could have opportunities they never dreamed of. My father worked construction until his knees gave out, and my mother cleaned houses for the wealthy elite of Manhattan, coming home every night smelling like lemon pledge and exhaustion. They never complained, never asked for anything, just kept pushing forward with this quiet dignity that broke my heart every single time I thought about it. So when I made my first real money, serious money, that had commas and zeros that made my accountant practically giddy, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to give them the retirement they deserved, somewhere beautiful where they could watch sunsets instead of subway cars, where the only thing my mother had to clean was whatever she damn well pleased, where my father could fish instead of worrying about whether his pension would cover another surgery. I spent 6 months working with a real estate agent in upstate New York, touring properties that ranged from decent to absolutely spectacular, until I found it. The lake house sat on 3 acres of pristine waterfront property in the Finger Lakes region, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking water so blue it looked photoshopped, a wraparound deck made of Brazilian hardwood, 5 bedrooms, each with their own bathroom, a gourmet kitchen that would make Gordon Ramsay weep, and a boat dock that came with a speedboat I threw in as a bonus. The whole package cost me $487,000, and I paid cash because I could, and because I wanted my parents to own it outright. No mortgage, no strings, no worries. Thanksgiving dinner that year was at my place, the penthouse overlooking Central Park, with catering from Jean-Georges because I had never been good at cooking and saw no reason to start pretending now. My parents arrived early, my mother fussing over the flower arrangements I'd had delivered, my father standing awkwardly by the window like he always did in my apartment, uncomfortable with wealth even though he'd earned every bit of comfort it could provide. Dante showed up 2 hours late with his wife Veronica, both of them dressed like they were attending a Fashion Week after party rather than a family dinner. My brother had always been the charmer, the smooth talker who could convince anyone of anything, which served him well in his career as a luxury real estate broker in the Hamptons. Veronica was his perfect match. A former model turned influencer who spent her days photographing overpriced handbags and her nights attending gallery openings where the art was terrible, but the champagne was expensive. The dinner itself was fine, pleasant even, with my mother asking about my work and my father telling the same fishing stories he'd been telling for 20 years. Dante spent most of the meal on his phone, probably texting clients about properties they couldn't afford, while Veronica pushed food around her plate like she was afraid calories might attack her if she actually consumed them. When dessert arrived, some pretentious deconstructed pumpkin pie situation that cost more than it had any right to, I stood up and cleared my throat. My hands were shaking slightly, not from nerves but from pure excitement, because I'd been holding on to the secret for months and couldn't wait another second to share it. I pulled out the Tiffany box, the weight of the keys inside somehow feeling heavier than they should, and walked over to where my parents sat. My mother looked confused, probably expecting jewelry or something equally impersonal, but my father's eyes got this soft look that made me remember why I'd worked so hard in the first place. I opened the box, and there they were. 2 sets of keys on a custom keychain engraved with their names and the words, "Home, Sweet Home," along with a leather folder containing the deed, property information, and photos of their new lake house. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears that she tried to blink away.
and my father just stared at the keys like they might disappear if he looked away. The explanation tumbled out of me in a rush, words tripping over themselves as I described the property, the location, the amenities, everything I'd spent months planning down to the last detail. I told them about the heated floors, the gas fireplace, the master suite with the soaking tub that overlooked the lake, the reading nook I'd had built specifically because my mother loved to read but never had a quiet place to do it. I told them they could move in whenever they wanted, that I'd hired movers to help pack up their apartment, that everything was taken care of and all they had to do was say yes. My mother was crying openly now, clutching the keys like they were made of gold, and my father pulled me into a hug so tight I could barely breathe, whispering thank you over and over into my hair. Dante's reaction was harder to read. He smiled, said all the right things, congratulated me on being such a generous daughter, but something flickered behind his eyes that I couldn't quite name.
It might have been jealousy, might have been calculation, might have been nothing at all, but I noticed it just the same. Veronica's reaction was easier to interpret, because she wore her thoughts on her face like designer makeup. Subtle to some, but obvious to anyone paying attention. She looked annoyed, maybe even a little angry, and when she leaned over to whisper something in Dante's ear, he nodded slowly, like they were agreeing on something that had nothing to do with celebration. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of excitement and planning. My mother wanted to know about the neighborhood, the town, the nearest grocery store, all the practical details that I'd researched obsessively. My father asked about the boat, the fishing spots, whether the dock could handle a bigger vessel if he decided to upgrade. Dante contributed suggestions about interior designers and furniture stores, playing the role of helpful son with practiced ease, while Veronica took photos of the property information for her Instagram story with the caption "Family Goals" that made me want to throw up a little. By the time they left, my parents were glowing with happiness that made the entire purchase worth every penny. And I went to bed that night feeling like I'd finally done something truly meaningful with all the money I'd earned. My parents moved into the Lakehouse 2 weeks later, right before Christmas, and I helped them settle in despite having 3 major client presentations that week. The place looked even better with their furniture in it. Their personal touches transforming it from a beautiful house into a real home. My mother planted bulbs in the garden, even though it was too late in the season, insisting they'd bloom in spring. And my father spent hours on the dock just staring at the water like he couldn't believe it was real. They called me every day for the first month, describing sunrises and wildlife sightings and neighbors they'd met at the local diner. Dante visited once, stayed for an afternoon, took photos of everything, and left with promises to come back soon that sounded sincere enough, even if I had my doubts. The problems started 3 months later, though I didn't know it at the time. My parents stopped calling as frequently, and when they did, they seemed distracted, their stories shorter and less enthusiastic. I chalked it up to them settling into a routine, adjusting to retirement life, finding their rhythm in a new place. I was drowning in work, closing a deal with a Fortune 500 company that required me to practically live in conference rooms and hotel suites, so I didn't push too hard when conversations felt off. When I suggested visiting in April, my mother made excuses about the weather being unpredictable and the roads being difficult to navigate, reasons that seemed plausible enough that I didn't question them. It was early May when I finally made the drive upstate, showing up unannounced because I wanted to surprise them and because something in my gut told me I needed to see things for myself. The drive took about 4 hours, winding through increasingly rural landscapes that traded skyscrapers for farms and concrete for trees. The property looked immaculate from the road, the lawn perfectly manicured, the gardens blooming with flowers my mother must have planted, everything exactly as it should be. I pulled into the circular driveway, noticing with some confusion that my parents' old sedan was nowhere to be seen, but there were 2 other vehicles I didn't recognize, a black Range Rover, and a silver Mercedes convertible that probably cost more than most people's houses. I grabbed the bags I'd brought, weekend luggage and gifts I'd picked up in the city, and walked up to the front door, already imagining my mother's face when she saw me. I tried the door handle, expecting it to be unlocked because my parents had never been paranoid about security, but it didn't budge. I tried again, thinking maybe it was just stuck, but no, it was definitely locked, which was weird because they'd never mentioned changing their habits. I knocked, waited, knocked again louder, but nobody came. I walked around the side of the house, peering through windows that should have shown me a cozy living room with my parents' furniture, but instead I saw completely different decor, modern and expensive, and nothing like what I'd helped them arrange. Panic started creeping up my spine, cold and insistent, telling me something was very wrong here. I walked around to the back of the house, climbed the steps to the deck, and that's when I heard voices, laughter, music playing from inside the house that sounded like a party or gathering. I tried the sliding glass doors, found them locked too, and pressed my face against the glass to see inside. What I saw made my blood run cold and my hands ball into fists that wanted to punch through the expensive glass. There was Dante, my brother, lounging on a white leather sofa I'd never seen before, surrounded by people I didn't recognize, all of them holding drinks and laughing like they own the damn place. And there was Veronica, holding court in the kitchen that was supposed to be my mother's, wearing a designer dress and heels like she was hosting some kind of luxury retreat. I pounded on the glass hard enough to rattle the frame, and every head in the room turned toward me. Dante's expression flickered through surprise, annoyance, and finally settled on something that looked almost like amusement. He said something to his guests, stood up with the casual confidence of someone who had every right to be there, and walked over to the door. He didn't open it immediately, just stood there on the other side of the glass, looking at me like I was an unexpected delivery rather than his sister who'd bought this entire property. When he finally slid the door open, he didn't invite me in, just stood in the doorway, blocking my entrance like a bouncer at an exclusive club. His first words were not hello, not surprised to see you, Ileana, but rather a casual, you should have called first, Ileana, we're entertaining clients. I stared at him, unable to process what I was hearing, unable to reconcile this scenario with any version of reality that made sense. I pushed past him into the house, ignoring his protests, and looked around at what should have been my parents' retirement home. Everything was different, professionally redecorated in that sterile modern style that belonged in design magazines rather than actual homes where people lived. The furniture my parents had brought was gone, replaced with pieces that probably cost more than they'd earned in a year of work combined. The photos I'd helped them hang were missing, swapped out for abstract art that meant nothing to anyone. I spun around to face Dante, my voice shaking with rage I could barely control. Where are Mom and Dad? What the hell is going on here? He had the audacity to look annoyed, like I was the one being unreasonable, like I was interrupting something important, rather than discovering that my gift to our parents had been somehow stolen. They're fine, he said, waving his hand dismissively. They're staying in the garage apartment while we renovate the main house. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach, the air rushing out of my lungs so fast I had to lean against the wall to stay upright. The garage apartment! The space above the 3-car garage that was maybe 400 square feet total, designed as storage or maybe a workshop, not a living space, definitely not suitable for 2 people in their 70s who deserved so much better. I didn't wait for permission, didn't listen to Dante calling after me, just turned and ran out of the house, down the deck stairs, across the lawn to the detached garage at the edge of the property. The exterior door was unlocked, and I climbed the narrow stairs to the apartment above, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might crack a rib. What I found at the top of those stairs will haunt me for the rest of my life. Images that burned themselves into my brain with the permanence of scars. My parents were living in that tiny space, sleeping on an old futon that sagged in the middle, their clothes hanging from a tension rod someone had installed across one corner. There was a hot plate for cooking, a mini fridge that hummed loudly, a heat span, even though it was May, because apparently the garage wasn't properly insulated. My mother sat at a card table that served as their dining area, reading a library book because there wasn't room for her actual bookshelf, and my father was nowhere to be seen, probably off somewhere because he couldn't stand to be in that claustrophobic space any longer than necessary. When my mother looked up and saw me standing in the doorway, the expression on her face broke something fundamental inside me, something that had always believed family was sacred and love was unconditional and people who shared blood would protect each other. She looked ashamed, embarrassed, defeated in a way I'd never seen in all the years of watching her work impossible hours for ungrateful employers. She stood up quickly, tried to smile, tried to pretend this was all somehow normal or acceptable, but her hands were shaking and her eyes were wet with tears she wouldn't let fall. "Ileana," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "what are you doing here, mija?" I couldn't speak, couldn't form words past the rage and grief and absolute fury that was choking me. I walked over and pulled her into a hug, feeling how thin she'd gotten, how frail she felt in my arms when she'd always been so strong. She held on to me like I was a life raft in an ocean that was trying to drown her, and when she finally started crying, really crying, it was like a dam breaking after too much pressure for too long. The story came out in broken pieces, fragments of nightmare that I had to assemble into something coherent. Dante had shown up 2 months ago, right after his last visit, with Veronica and a moving truck full of furniture. He told them he needed to stay for a while, just temporary, while he expanded his real estate business into the region. My parents, because they were kind and trusting and couldn't imagine their son would hurt them, said yes. That first week was fine. Normal even, Dante and Veronica staying in one of the guest rooms, helping with household tasks, being pleasant company. Then, Dante announced he was having the locks changed for security purposes, said it was necessary because of valuable client information he'd be keeping at the house. My parents didn't object because it seemed reasonable enough. What happened next was so calculated, so deliberately cruel that I could barely process it. Dante started inviting clients to the house, using it as a showcase property for his real estate business, telling potential buyers about the luxury Lakehouse lifestyle, while my parents watched their home being turned into a sales tool. When my mother objected, Dante pulled up paperwork, documents he claimed showed that he owned the property, that the deed had been transferred to him legally. My father demanded to see the original paperwork I'd given them on Thanksgiving, but somehow it had disappeared, vanished from wherever they'd stored it. Dante suggested they'd misunderstood the arrangement, that I'd always intended for him to manage the property, and that they were welcome to stay in the garage apartment as long as they needed. The worst part, the detail that made me want to commit violence against my own brother, was that when my mother tried to call me to explain what was happening, Veronica had laughed in her face, actually laughed, this cruel, dismissive sound, and told her that I was too busy with my important career to care about their problems, that they should be grateful Dante was willing to let them stay on the property at all. My mother, broken by years of being told she wasn't good enough by the people she cleaned for, believed it. She believed that maybe I had made some arrangement with Dante, that maybe she had misunderstood the gift, that maybe she didn't deserve the beautiful house I'd worked so hard to give her. I held my mother while she cried, while she apologized for being a burden, while she insisted that they were fine in the garage apartment and didn't want to cause trouble. Rage doesn't even begin to cover what I felt in that moment. It was beyond anger, beyond fury, something primal and consuming that made my vision narrow and my hands shake with the need to hurt someone the way my parents had been hurt. But I forced myself to stay calm, to think strategically, because Dante was clearly playing some kind of long game, and I needed to understand the rules before I could win. I helped my mother down the stairs, told her we were going to fix this, promised her, with every ounce of conviction I possessed, that she would be sleeping in her own bed in the main house tonight. We walked back across the lawn together, my arm around her shoulders, and I could see Dante watching from the deck, arms crossed, that same amused expression on his face, like he was enjoying some private joke. His guests had apparently left or been ushered away because the house was quieter now, just Dante and Veronica standing there like they were monarchs surveying their kingdom. I climbed the deck stairs with my mother following close behind, and when I reached the top, I looked my brother straight in his lying eyes. "We need to talk," I said, my voice deadly calm in a way that made Veronica take a step back. Dante just smiled, that charming salesman smile that had probably closed 1,000 deals, and gestured toward the house like he was inviting us into his home rather than the property I'd purchased. "Of course," he said smoothly. "Let's discuss this like adults." I wanted to discuss it like prize fighters, wanted to wipe that smile off his face with my fists. But I followed him inside because violence wouldn't solve this, at least not yet. The confrontation that followed was a masterclass in gaslighting and manipulation, Dante deploying every trick in his arsenal to convince me that I was the one being unreasonable. He showed me documents, paperwork that looked official and legitimate, claiming the property had been transferred to him through some legal arrangement I'd allegedly authorized. The deed he showed me had my signature on it, or something that looked enough like my signature to be convincing, along with dates and notary stamps that seemed authentic. He explained in his patient, condescending voice that I'd set up the transfer to avoid estate tax issues, that he was holding the property in trust for our parents, that this was all part of some complex financial planning I'd supposedly requested. It was complete bullshit, every word of it. But he delivered it with such confidence that I could see how my parents had been fooled. Veronica chimed in with supporting details, playing the role of concerned sister-in-law, suggesting that maybe I'd forgotten the arrangement because I'd been so busy with work. The audacity of it was almost impressive, the sheer scope of the deception so brazen that part of me wanted to applaud his creativity, even as I wanted to destroy him. But I kept my face neutral, kept my voice calm, because I needed him to think I believed him, needed him to feel secure in his lie so I could figure out how to dismantle it. I asked to see the deed again, studied it carefully, while Dante watched with barely concealed satisfaction. The document looked legitimate at first glance. Professional printing on proper legal paper with all the right stamps and signatures. But I've closed enough business deals to know what real legal documents look like, and something about this one felt off. Details I couldn't quite name, but that my instincts flagged as suspicious. I asked when the transfer had supposedly occurred, and Dante gave me a date in February, right after my parents had moved in and when I'd been drowning in the Fortune 500 deal. He claimed I'd signed the paperwork at some meeting we'd supposedly had in the city, a meeting I had absolutely no memory of because it had never happened. I handed the deed back to him, maintaining my neutral expression while my mind raced through possibilities. Either Dante had somehow forged my signature well enough to fool notaries and create official-looking documents, or he'd found some other way to manipulate the system. Either way, he'd committed fraud on a spectacular scale, and the only question was how to prove it without tipping him off that I was onto him. I told him I needed time to review my records, to check with my lawyers, to verify the details of this arrangement I supposedly couldn't remember. He agreed easily, too easily, confident that his forgeries would hold up to scrutiny, or arrogant enough to believe I'd eventually accept his version of events. What neither Dante nor Veronica knew, what they couldn't possibly have anticipated, was that I wasn't just some tech consultant who understood business. I was someone who'd spent years studying systems, finding vulnerabilities, exploiting weaknesses in supposedly secure frameworks. And my brother had just made the mistake of challenging me in my own arena, not realizing that the skills I'd used to build my career were exactly the same skills I'd need to take him down. As I left the lake house that evening, my mother clutching my hand and my father emerging from wherever he'd been hiding to give me a hug that felt like goodbye, I made a silent promise that I would fix this, no matter what it took, no matter what I had to sacrifice. The drive back to the city was 4 hours of pure planning, my mind working through strategies and possibilities while my hands gripped the steering wheel hard enough to leave indentations. I knew what I had to do, the steps I'd need to take, the people I'd need to call. This wasn't just about getting back a piece of property or correcting a legal error. This was about justice for my parents, punishment for my brother's betrayal, and revenge served cold and calculated in a way that would make him regret ever crossing someone who loved harder than he could lie. Dante thought he'd won, thought he'd outsmarted everyone, thought his charm and his forgeries and his audacity would carry him through. He had no idea who he was dealing with, no concept of what was coming, no understanding that the sister who'd given her parents a lake house out of love could turn that same intensity toward destruction if pushed too far. And I'd been pushed way, way too far. The first call I made was at 2 in the morning, parked in a rest stop somewhere on the Taconic Parkway, my phone screen glowing like a beacon in the darkness. Marcus Chen answered on the third ring, his voice groggy but alert the second he heard the edge in my tone. Marcus was my attorney, the kind of lawyer who charged $800 an hour and was worth every penny because he didn't just know the law, he knew how to bend it without breaking it, how to find loopholes in contracts that looked airtight, how to destroy opponents so thoroughly they wished they'd never set foot in a courtroom. We'd worked together on dozens of deals, and he owed me favors from cases I'd steered his way, favors I was about to cash in with interest. I gave him the abbreviated version, the key facts, stripped of emotion because Marcus didn't deal in feelings. He dealt in evidence and strategy and billable hours. My brother had forged documents to steal property I'd purchased for our parents, had somehow created a deed with my signature that I'd never signed, had kicked elderly people out of their own home, and was now using it as his personal real estate showcase. Marcus was quiet for a long moment after I finished, the kind of silence that meant his brilliant legal mind was already 3 steps ahead, calculating angles and possibilities. When he finally spoke, his voice had that sharp quality that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. He told me to meet him at his office at 8 a.m. sharp to bring every piece of documentation I had related to the property purchase, every email, every bank transfer, every conversation I could remember. He said we'd need to move fast because if Dante had gone to the trouble of forging a deed, he probably had other plans in motion, possibly looking to sell the property or leverage it for loans before anyone could challenge his claim. The thought made my stomach clench because if he sold it to some unsuspecting buyer, untangling that mess would take years and might not even be possible. I promised Marcus I'd be there with everything he needed, then ended the call and sat in the darkness trying to process the magnitude of what my brother had done. The second call was harder, required me to swallow pride I didn't know I still possessed. James Sullivan had been my mentor when I first started in tech consulting, the guy who'd taken a chance on a hungry kid from Queens with more ambition than experience and taught me everything about reading people, closing deals, and playing the long game. We'd had a falling out 3 years ago over a client I thought I'd poached, harsh words exchanged that couldn't be taken back, professional bridges burned so completely I'd deleted his number from my phone. But James had connections I needed, specifically connections to private investigators who specialized in financial fraud and document forgery, the kind of investigators who didn't advertise their services but could dig up dirt that would make prosecutors salivate. I found his number through an old email chain, hesitated with my finger hovering over the call button, then pressed it before I could talk myself out of it. He answered immediately, his voice still carrying that gruff New York accent that no amount of success had polished away. I expected anger, expected him to hang up the second he recognized my voice, but instead he just said my name, like a question, like he was trying to figure out if this was really happening. I apologized for calling so late, apologized for the way things had ended between us, then laid out what I needed without any of the usual small talk or social niceties. James listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he let out a low whistle that somehow conveyed both sympathy and satisfaction. He said he knew exactly who I needed, a guy named Tommy Rizzuto who'd worked organized crime cases for the FBI before going private, someone who could trace document chains and spot forgeries that fooled everyone else. James gave me Tommy's number, told me to mention his name, and that the first consultation would be on him, a gift for old times that felt more like an olive branch than charity. I thanked him with genuine gratitude that surprised us both, and before he hung up, he said something that stuck with me through the rest of that long night. He said family betrayal was the worst kind because it came from people who were supposed to protect you, that it poisoned everything it touched, but that it also revealed who you really were when the masks came off. I wasn't sure if he meant Dante or me, but either way, he was right. By the time I made it back to the city, dawn was breaking over Manhattan, painting the skyscrapers in shades of orange and gold that would have been beautiful if I'd been in any state to appreciate it. I went straight home, showered off the grime of the drive and the emotional residue of the worst day I could remember, then pulled out every file related to the Lakehouse purchase. The closing documents were in a safe deposit box at my bank, but I had digital copies of everything. The purchase agreement, the title search, the deed with my name listed as sole owner, wire transfer confirmations showing the money leaving my account. I organized everything chronologically, created a timeline of events from the first property viewing to the Thanksgiving dinner where I'd given my parents the keys, noting every interaction I'd had with Dante along the way. Marcus's office was in Midtown, one of those glass towers where the elevators moved so fast your ears popped, and the reception area had art that probably cost more than the Lakehouse. His assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia, who'd been gatekeeping for him since before I started my career, waved me through without the usual security theater. Marcus was already in his office, despite the early hour, surrounded by law books and case files, his desk a controlled chaos that somehow made perfect sense to him. He looked like he hadn't slept, which probably meant he'd spent the night researching property fraud statutes and precedents, doing the groundwork that would make the difference between winning and losing. I spread my documents across his conference table, watching him examine each one with the focused intensity of a surgeon reviewing scans before a critical operation. He asked questions in rapid fire, his pen scratching notes on a legal pad while I explained the timeline, the transfer I'd never authorized, the signature that looked like mine but couldn't be because I'd never signed any such document. When I got to the part about my parents living in the garage, his jaw tightened in a way that told me he was personally offended by what Dante had done, which was good because I needed him angry. Needed him to bring the full weight of his considerable talent to destroying my brother's lies. The analysis took 2 hours, Marcus going over every detail while making phone calls to experts I didn't know, asking technical questions about notary fraud and signature verification. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and delivered his assessment with the clinical precision of a doctor diagnosing a terminal illness. The deed Dante had shown me was almost certainly a forgery, but it was a damn good one. Good enough that it had probably been created by professionals rather than some amateur with a scanner and Photoshop. The signature analysis would require bringing in handwriting experts, the notary stamp would need to be verified against official records, and we'd need to pull the actual filed deed from the county clerk's office to see what was in the official record versus what Dante was showing around. The problem, Marcus explained while my stomach sank toward my shoes, was that property fraud cases were slow, bureaucratic nightmares that could take months or even years to resolve through official channels. We'd need to file a lawsuit, challenging the deed, get a court order for handwriting analysis, subpoena records from the notary, potentially bring in forensic document examiners whose testimony cost thousands of dollars per hour. And even if we proved the forgery, which Marcus seemed confident we could, there was no guarantee we could get my parents back in the house quickly. Dante could drag things out with motions and delays, could potentially even sell the property to a third party who'd be protected as a good faith buyer, could make this entire process so expensive and time-consuming that my parents would be dead before they saw justice. I sat there, absorbing this information, feeling the rage I'd been controlling threaten to explode out of my chest. Because this wasn't just about legal strategy or courtroom victories. This was about two people in their 70s sleeping on a futon in a garage while their son threw parties in the home I'd bought them. Marcus must have seen something in my face because he held up a hand in a gesture that said, "Wait, there's more." He explained that while the legal route would be our ultimate backup plan, there might be a faster way, a more direct approach that would require me to play the same game Dante was playing, to match his deception with counter-deception, to fight dirty in ways that courts didn't like to acknowledge, but that often produced results. The plan he outlined was risky, borderline illegal in ways that made my palms sweat. But it was also brilliant in its simplicity. We needed to catch Dante in the act of fraud, needed documented evidence that he knew the deed was forged, needed him on record making claims he couldn't possibly back up. Marcus suggested I play along with Dante's story, pretend to believe the forgery, act like I was confused about the transfer rather than certain it was fake. Meanwhile, we'd be building a parallel case, gathering evidence through channels Dante wouldn't know about, setting traps that would force him to lie in ways we could prove were lies. It was psychological warfare disguised as family reconciliation, and it required me to be a better actor than I'd ever been in my life. The other piece of the plan involved Tommy Rizzuto, the investigator James had recommended. Marcus made the introduction call while I listened, explaining what we needed in terms vague enough to maintain plausible deniability. Tommy agreed to meet me that afternoon at a coffee shop in Brooklyn, neutral territory where we could talk without worrying about who might be watching or listening. Marcus stressed that whatever Tommy found, however he found it, needed to be discoverable through legitimate channels eventually, that we couldn't build a case on evidence obtained through methods that would get thrown out of court, or worse, land us in legal trouble ourselves. I left Marcus's office with a plan and a sense of purpose that felt better than the helpless rage I'd been carrying. The morning was shot, my calendar full of meetings I'd need to reschedule, but none of that mattered because this was more important than any client or contract or business deal. I called my assistant, told her I had a family emergency and would be unreachable for the next few days, instructed her to push everything that could be pushed and cancel everything else. She didn't ask questions because she'd worked for me long enough to know when I was serious, just confirmed she'd handle it and wished me luck with whatever I was dealing with. The coffee shop in Brooklyn was the kind of place that served artisanal everything and had Edison bulbs hanging from exposed brick. Hipster aesthetic that normally made me roll my eyes, but today barely registered. Tommy Rizzuto was already there when I arrived, sitting in a back corner with a clear view of the entrance. Exactly what I'd expect from someone with his background. He looked nothing like I had imagined. No tough guy stereotype or intimidating presence. Just a middle-aged man in jeans and a button-down shirt who could have been an accountant or a teacher or any other regular person you'd pass on the street without a second glance. The conversation started carefully, both of us feeling each other out, establishing trust that was necessary for what came next. Tommy asked detailed questions about Dante, his business, his connections, his lifestyle, building a profile that would help him know where to look for vulnerabilities. I told him everything I knew, from Dante's luxury real estate career to his social media presence to his wife's influencer lifestyle, painting a picture of two people who lived beyond their means and constantly chased status they couldn't quite afford. Tommy nodded along, making notes in a small leather notebook, occasionally asking follow-up questions that showed he was several steps ahead of where I was. When I got to the part about the forged deed, Tommy's expression shifted into something harder, more focused, the professional investigator emerging from behind the mild-mannered exterior. He explained that document forgery at this level typically involved either someone with access to official templates and stamps, possibly through corrupt connections in government offices, or highly skilled forgers who charged serious money for their services. Either way, it meant Dante had planned this carefully, had invested time and resources into creating documents that would stand up to casual scrutiny. But Tommy also said that no forgery was perfect, that there were always tells if you knew where to look, small inconsistencies in fonts or paper quality or filing procedures that experts could spot. The investigation Tommy proposed would take about a week, maybe 2 if they ran into complications, and would cost me $15,000 plus expenses. He'd start by pulling all public records related to the property, checking filing dates and document histories, looking for anomalies that didn't match up with the timeline I'd provided. He'd verify the notary information against state licensing databases, check whether the stamps and signatures on Dante's documents matched official records or if they'd been fabricated. He'd also run background checks on Dante and Veronica, looking at their financial situation, their debts, their business dealings, anything that might explain why they'd need to steal a $500,000 property from their own family. I agreed to his terms without negotiation, gave him a retainer check on the spot, and provided him with everything I had on Dante, from social media profiles to business addresses to mutual contacts who might know things they didn't realize they knew. Tommy said he'd start immediately, would have preliminary findings within 3 days, and would only contact me through encrypted channels, because if Dante was smart enough to forge a deed, he was probably smart enough to monitor communications if he suspected someone was investigating him. The paranoia felt excessive until Tommy explained that people who commit fraud are typically hyper-vigilant about being caught, that they watch for signs of suspicion and react aggressively when threatened, and that I needed to assume everything I did or said could potentially get back to my brother. The afternoon I spent preparing for the performance of my life, rehearsing the role of confused sister who might believe she'd authorized a property transfer and just forgotten about it. I needed to be convincing enough that Dante would relax his guard, but not so convincing that he'd think he'd won completely. Needed to maintain enough uncertainty to justify asking questions while appearing to accept his version of events. It was a delicate balance, the kind of manipulation I'd use in business negotiations, but never thought I'd deploy against family, which made me wonder if I was becoming the kind of person I'd always despised. That evening, I called Dante, forced warmth into my voice that made me feel physically ill, and told him I'd been thinking about our conversation at the Lakehouse. I said I'd checked with my accountant and couldn't find any record of the transfer, but that my files were a mess and maybe I really had authorized it during that crazy period in February when I'd been working 18-hour days. I could hear the satisfaction in his voice as he assured me that yes, we'd definitely discussed it, that he had all the paperwork and I shouldn't worry because everything was handled properly. I asked if we could meet in the city to go over the documents again, said I wanted to understand the arrangement better so I could explain it to our parents who seemed confused about the whole situation. Dante agreed readily, suggested dinner at some overpriced steakhouse in Midtown that he probably couldn't actually afford, and I accepted with fake enthusiasm that made my jaw ache from forcing the smile into my voice. We set it for 2 days later, giving me time to coordinate with Marcus and Tommy, time to plan exactly what I needed to say, and ask to build the case we were constructing. After I hung up, I sat in my apartment staring out at the city lights, thinking about how the brother I'd grown up with, the kid who defended me from bullies in elementary school and taught me how to ride a bike, had become someone capable of such calculated cruelty toward the people who'd sacrificed everything for us. The next morning, I drove back upstate, this time with a purpose beyond just checking on my parents. I needed to see the house again with investigative eyes rather than emotional ones. Needed to document what Dante had done. Needed to gather evidence that would support our case when we finally brought it. I brought a camera this time. Expensive equipment I normally used for photographing properties I was evaluating for clients, and I planned to capture every detail of how my parents were living versus how Dante had taken over. My parents were expecting me this time, my mother waiting anxiously by the garage apartment window when I pulled up. She'd clean the tiny space obsessively, trying to make it presentable in that heartbreaking way she'd always tried to make the best of bad situations. My father looked worse than he had days before, more defeated, like the hope I'd tried to give him was draining away faster than he could hold on to it. I hugged them both, told them about the lawyers and the investigators and the plan to get them back in their house, watched their faces cycle through hope and doubt and fear that believing might hurt worse than accepting their situation. I spent an hour photographing the garage apartment from every angle, documenting the cramped conditions, the inadequate heating, the makeshift kitchen setup that was probably a dozen fire code violations. My mother tried to stop me at first, embarrassed by what I was capturing, but I explained gently that we needed evidence, that courts responded to documentation, that these photos might be what convinced a judge to act quickly rather than letting this drag on for months. She understood eventually, stopped trying to tidy things before I took each shot, let me capture the reality of what Dante had done to them. After finishing in the garage, I walked down to the main house, tried the doors and found them all locked, then walked the perimeter taking photos through every window I could reach.
The interior looked even more expensive than I'd first thought. Furniture that had to cost 6 figures total, artwork on the walls that screamed professional designer, every detail curated to project wealth and status. I documented all of it, knowing Tommy would want to see what Dante was spending money on, knowing it would help establish motive when we needed to explain why he'd commit fraud in the first place. I was on the deck taking photos of the lake view when Dante pulled up, his Range Rover crunching gravel in the driveway like an announcement of his arrival. He got out quickly, his face transitioning from surprise to annoyance to forced pleasantness in the space of seconds. He called out, asking what I was doing, his tone suggesting I was the one trespassing rather than him being the thief. I turned and gave him my brightest fake smile, said I was just admiring the renovations he'd done, that the place looked incredible, that I could see why his clients were impressed. The compliments disarmed him, like I knew they would, his ego too large to resist positive feedback, even from someone who should be his enemy. He invited me inside, playing the gracious host in what should have been our parents' home, and I accepted because I wanted to see the interior properly, wanted to understand exactly what he'd done with the property. The tour he gave me was revealing in ways he didn't intend. His descriptions of the changes he'd made, the designer he'd hired, the contractors who'd done the renovations, all pieces of information that would help Tommy trace money flows and timelines. I asked questions that sounded like admiration, but were actually gathering evidence, complimenting his taste while mentally calculating what everything must have cost, wondering how a real estate broker who worked on commission could afford this level of luxury. Veronica appeared halfway through the tour, dressed like she was about to shoot a lifestyle magazine spread, all designer casual wear and carefully tousled hair. She seemed surprised to see me, less pleased than Dante about my presence, but she played along with forced friendliness that was even less convincing than mine. She offered coffee from some espresso machine that probably cost more than my parents' monthly Social Security checks, and I accepted, sitting at the kitchen island that overlooked the lake while she fussed with milk frothers and syrups. The conversation was painful. Small talk that felt like walking through a minefield, each of us saying things that meant something different beneath the surface. I steered the conversation toward their business, asked how real estate was going, whether they were thinking about expanding beyond the Hamptons. Veronica jumped at the chance to talk about herself, describing their plans to become major players in luxury upstate properties, how they were building a portfolio of high-end listings, how this Lakehouse was their showcase property that would attract serious buyers. She said all of this without apparent awareness that she was essentially confessing to using stolen property for business purposes, and I nodded along while mentally adding her statements to the evidence list growing in my head. When I finally left, promising to meet Dante for dinner in 2 days as planned, I felt physically exhausted from maintaining the performance. My parents walked me to my car, their faces showing confusion about why I was being friendly with their tormentor. And I had to explain quietly that I was building a case, that I needed Dante to feel safe so he'd make mistakes, that justice sometimes required patience and strategy rather than immediate confrontation.
My father understood first, his construction worker's practical mind grasping the concept of undermining a structure before bringing it down, and he squeezed my hand in solidarity. My mother looked less convinced, but trusted me enough to not interfere, though I could see the fear in her eyes that I was somehow being manipulated into accepting Dante's lies. The drive back to the city was quieter than the previous trips, my mind cycling through everything I'd learned, everything I'd documented, everything I still needed to know. Tommy called halfway through the drive, his voice tight with excitement that meant he'd found something significant. He said we needed to meet immediately, that he'd uncovered information that changed everything, that what he'd discovered was worse than simple fraud, but also potentially our strongest weapon. I told him to meet me at my apartment in 2 hours, then pressed the accelerator harder, suddenly desperate to know what he'd found. Tommy arrived exactly on time, carrying a messenger bag full of documents and wearing an expression that was equal parts grim and satisfied. What he laid out on my dining room table was a web of financial crimes so complex I struggled to follow all the threads at first. Dante wasn't just using the Lakehouse as a showcase property. He was actively trying to sell it, had already lined up a potential buyer, a real estate investment firm looking for luxury properties to flip. The sale was scheduled to close in 3 weeks, pending final inspections and paperwork, for $650,000, $160,000 more than I'd paid for it less than a year ago. But it got worse, so much worse that I had to sit down because my legs literally wouldn't hold me up anymore. Dante had taken out a home equity line of credit against the property using the forged deed, had borrowed $200,000 from a private lender at an interest rate that suggested either desperation or stupidity. That money was already spent, based on Tommy's investigation into their financial records, gone on the renovations, on Veronica's lifestyle expenses, on business investments that hadn't paid off. They were drowning in debt, both personal and business-related, had maxed out credit cards and taken loans from people who weren't as nice as traditional banks. The forgery, Tommy explained, was sophisticated enough to have cost serious money, probably $20,000 to $30,000 for the documents and the corrupt notary who'd stamped them. That investment only made sense if they were planning to profit substantially, which the sale would provide. But the timeline was tight, too tight, which meant they'd been planning this since before Thanksgiving, possibly since before I'd even bought the property.
Tommy had found text messages between Dante and Veronica, recovered from Veronica's iCloud backup through methods I didn't ask about and didn't want to know, discussing the Lakehouse and its potential value before I'd ever given my parents the keys. The implication made me feel sick. The realization that my brother had seen my gift to our parents not as an act of love, but as an opportunity for theft, that he'd started planning to steal it before they'd even moved in. Tommy showed me screenshots of the messages, Veronica asking if Dante was sure he could pull it off, Dante assuring her that I was too busy to pay attention, that our parents were too trusting to fight back, that by the time anyone realized what happened, the property would be sold and the money would be gone. There was calculation in those messages, cold planning that treated our parents as obstacles rather than people, that treated me as a mark to be conned rather than family to be respected. The evidence Tommy had compiled was devastating, but also raised a critical question. How much of it was admissible in court? Marcus would need to determine what we could use officially versus what was just background information that guided our strategy. But regardless of legal technicalities, we now knew their timeline, knew they were planning to close the sale in 3 weeks, knew we had to move fast or risk losing everything to a third-party buyer who'd be protected under law even if the deed was eventually proven fraudulent. Tommy's recommendation was to go to the police immediately, file criminal fraud charges that would freeze the property and prevent the sale. But he also warned that criminal cases move slowly, that prosecutors were overworked and might not prioritize what looked like a civil family dispute, that Dante could potentially talk his way out of initial charges if he had a good lawyer and the forged documents were convincing enough. The alternative was to beat him at his own game, to use what we knew to force a confession or catch him in lies that couldn't be explained away, to build such an overwhelming case that he'd have no choice but to surrender the property and face consequences.
I sat with this information for a long time after Tommy left, staring at the documents spread across my table, trying to decide between the safe, legal route and the riskier, strategic approach. My phone rang multiple times. Marcus calling to discuss next steps, my assistant checking in about clients I was neglecting, my mother probably wanting reassurance I couldn't quite give yet. I ignored all of it. Needed silence to think. Needed to understand what kind of person I was willing to become to get justice for my parents. The decision, when it finally crystallized, felt inevitable rather than chosen. I was going to that dinner with Dante, was going to look him in his lying face, was going to play the confused sister one more time while knowing exactly what he'd done and what he planned to do. But I was also going to be wearing a wire, recording every word he said, every confession he made without realizing he was confessing.
Marcus had arranged for the equipment through a private security firm that specialized in corporate espionage, technically legal for one-party consent recordings in New York, potentially usable as evidence if we needed it. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation, coaching sessions with Marcus on what questions to ask and how to phrase them, practice sessions where I rehearsed staying calm while discussing things that made me want to scream. The wire itself was surprisingly discreet, a small device that clipped inside my bra and a nearly invisible microphone that picked up conversations from several feet away. I tested it obsessively, paranoid that it would fail at the critical moment, that I'd go through this performance only to end up with nothing usable. Dinner with Dante was at Smith & Wollensky. Expensive dead animal and overpriced wine in an atmosphere designed to make wealthy people feel important. He was already there when I arrived, had probably shown up early to establish dominance or whatever psychological game he thought he was playing. I slid into the booth across from him, accepted the hug he offered like we were normal siblings having a normal dinner, and ordered the most expensive wine on the menu because he'd offered to pay, and I wanted this meal to hurt his wallet as much as possible. The conversation started with small talk, safe topics that let us both warm up to the real discussion. Dante asked about my work, pretended interesting clients and projects he'd never cared about, played the supportive brother role with practiced ease. I reciprocated, asked about his business, his clients, his plans for expansion, feeding his ego while mentally checking boxes on the list of questions Marcus had prepared. The wine arrived and we toasted to family. The irony so thick I almost choked on it, both of us smiling while meaning completely different things beneath the surface. When I finally brought up the Lakehouse, Dante's expression shifted subtly, a sharpening of focus that meant we were getting to what mattered. I told him I'd reviewed my files more carefully, that I still couldn't find any record of authorizing the transfer, but that I trusted him and wanted to understand the arrangement better. I asked him to walk me through exactly how it had happened, when we'd supposedly met, what documents I'd signed, details that would force him to commit to a specific story on record. He obliged, with the confidence of someone who believed his lies were bulletproof, describing a meeting that had never occurred, documents I'd never seen, conversations that existed only in his imagination. I asked about the notary, who had witnessed my signature, and Dante provided a name without hesitation, probably thinking I'd never bothered to check. I asked about the purpose of the transfer, why we'd set it up this way, and he explained the estate tax nonsense again, adding details that sounded plausible if you didn't know anything about tax law. I nodded along, asked follow-up questions that seemed like confusion rather than investigation, and watched him dig his hole deeper with every answer. The recorder was capturing everything, his voice clear and confident, damning himself with words he thought were protecting him. Then I asked the question Marcus had coached me on most carefully, the one designed to get him to admit foreknowledge and intent. I said I was confused about the timeline, that it seemed like he'd mentioned wanting to work in the area before I'd even bought the property, asked if he'd always planned to use it for his business. Dante hesitated for just a fraction of a second, caught between his story and the truth, then recovered with an explanation about how the opportunity had presented itself, how he'd recognized the potential once he saw the property, how it all worked out perfectly for everyone. The lie was so blatant, so contradicted by the text messages Tommy had found, that I almost called him out right there. But I held back, stayed in character, nodded like his explanation made sense, while making mental notes of every inconsistency. We finished dinner with more fake warmth, Dante picking up the check with a flourish that suggested money was no object, probably charging it to a credit card he couldn't actually pay off. When we parted ways outside the restaurant, he hugged me again, told me he was glad we'd cleared everything up, suggested I'd come visit the Lakehouse anytime I wanted. I walked away from that dinner feeling contaminated by his lies, by my own deception, by the whole ugly situation we were trapped in. But I also had what I needed: hours of recorded conversation where Dante described in detail a transfer that had never happened, committed to stories we could prove were false, revealed information about the property that only the true owner would know. Marcus would review the recording, would identify the strongest moments for potential legal use, would build them into a case that Dante couldn't talk his way out of no matter how charming he tried to be. The next morning, I met with Marcus and Tommy together. The three of us crowded into Marcus's office, reviewing everything we had. The recording was good, better than we'd hoped, with multiple clear admissions that contradicted documented facts. Tommy's financial investigation had uncovered the debt, the impending sale, the timeline that proved premeditation. Marcus's legal research had identified the statutes Dante had violated, the criminal charges that could be filed, the civil remedies that could get my parents back in the house quickly. But we still had one problem, one piece that didn't fit quite right in the puzzle we were assembling. The forged deed was too good, too professional, too expensive for what Dante could afford, even before he'd borrowed against the property. Someone had helped him, someone with resources and connections, someone who probably expected a cut of the profits when the sale went through. Marcus had theories, but no proof yet, was still digging into Dante's business associates and contacts, looking for the person or people who'd made this fraud possible.
The answer came from an unexpected source 3 days later. A phone call from my father that started with silence because he was too angry to speak. When he finally found words, they came out harsh and bitter, describing how he'd confronted Dante about the situation, how Dante had laughed in his face and told him to accept reality or find somewhere else to live. But more importantly, my father had overheard a conversation, Dante arguing with someone on the phone about money, about promises made, about a deal that needed to close soon or people would start asking questions they didn't want to answer. The name my father heard was Reginald Chen. Nobody I recognized, but somebody Tommy identified immediately with a curse that was both impressed and horrified. Reginald Chen was a major player in luxury real estate, operated on the edge of legality but had never been caught doing anything definitively criminal, known for aggressive tactics and deals that somehow always worked out in his favor. If Chen was involved, this was bigger than family drama, more serious than simple fraud, potentially connected to organized crime or money laundering operations that used real estate transactions to clean dirty money. Tommy said we needed to be careful, that people like Chen didn't take kindly to interference with their business, that we might be stepping into something dangerous beyond the legal risks we'd already accepted. But he also said Chen's involvement was leverage, that if we could prove the connection, we could possibly get federal agencies interested, turn this from a local fraud case into something much larger that would bring resources we couldn't access on our own. The pieces were falling into place, the full scope of Dante's betrayal becoming clear, and with it, the path to justice that would require every bit of skill and courage I could summon. How deep does the corruption go? What happens when Ileana confronts the powerful forces behind her brother's scheme? And what devastating secret will be revealed that changes everything she thought she knew about her family? The final battle is coming, and someone's world is about to burn. The decision to go after Reginald Chen was made in Marcus's office on a Tuesday morning that felt like the calm before a hurricane. The kind of stillness that makes your skin prickle because you know something massive is coming. Tommy had spent 72 hours digging into Chen's operations, barely sleeping, surviving on coffee and the kind of obsessive focus that separated good investigators from great ones. What he'd uncovered was a network so intricate, so carefully constructed, that part of me had to admire the sheer audacity of it, even as I wanted to burn the whole thing down. Chen wasn't just some dirty real estate developer. He was running a full-scale money laundering operation disguised as luxury property transactions. Dirty money from sources Tommy couldn't fully trace, but suspected involved everything from drug trafficking to offshore tax evasion, would flow into LLC purchases of high-end properties. The houses would get flipped or held for a period, then sold at inflated prices that generated clean money on the other side. Dante had somehow gotten mixed up in this world, probably through clients in the Hamptons who operated in those gray areas where extreme wealth met questionable ethics. Chen had spotted an opportunity in the Lakehouse, a property that could be acquired through fraud for nothing, renovated to increase value, then sold at a massive markup that would clean a substantial amount of dirty money while also generating legitimate profit. The original plan, based on text messages and financial records Tommy had obtained through methods I still didn't want to know about, was for Dante to forge the deed, push my parents out, renovate the property using Chen's money disguised as loans, then sell it to one of Chen's shell companies for an inflated price. Dante would get a cut, maybe $200,000 after paying off his debts, and Chen would have laundered close to $1 million through a transaction that looked completely legitimate on paper. My parents were collateral damage, obstacles to be removed, people who didn't matter in the grand scheme of making rich people richer through illegal means. The scope of it made me physically ill, not just because my brother had betrayed our family, but because he'd done it as part of a criminal conspiracy that treated human beings like chess pieces to be sacrificed for profit. But it also gave us leverage we hadn't had before, because if we could prove Chen's involvement, we could bring in federal law enforcement, agencies with resources and authority that could crush this operation and everyone involved in it. The risk was enormous, because people like Chen didn't go down without a fight because they had lawyers and connections and money to make problems disappear, sometimes along with the people causing those problems. Marcus laid out the strategy with the precision of a general planning a military campaign. We needed irrefutable evidence of Chen's involvement, documentation that connected him directly to the forged deed and the planned sale. Proof that would hold up in federal court and couldn't be dismissed as circumstantial or speculative. Tommy said he could get it, had identified a weak link in Chen's organization, an accountant named David Park who'd been handling the financial paperwork and who Tommy suspected was getting nervous about the whole operation. People in David's position often kept insurance files, evidence they could use to protect themselves if things went sideways. And Tommy thought he could persuade David to share what he had in exchange for immunity from prosecution. The persuasion took 3 days of careful negotiation, Tommy working channels I wasn't privy to, making calls and having meetings I wasn't invited to attend. When he finally called to say we had what we needed, the relief was so intense, I actually cried. Standing in my apartment, overlooking Central Park with tears streaming down my face, because finally, we had the ammunition to fight back. David Park had provided copies of everything. The forged documents with Chen's fingerprints all over them, emails discussing the fraud in language that was carefully coded but obvious once you knew what you were looking at, financial records showing money flowing from Chen's accounts to pay for the forgery and the renovations, and most damning of all, a recorded phone call where Chen and Dante discussed the timeline for the sale and how to handle my parents if they caused problems. Marcus took the evidence straight to the FBI's white-collar crime division, a contact he'd worked with on previous cases, and within 24 hours, we had federal agents interested, very interested in what we'd uncovered. The case they could build went beyond just the Lakehouse fraud, extended to dozens of other properties Chen had used for similar schemes, potentially hundreds of millions in laundered money that could be traced and recovered. They wanted to move fast, wanted to catch everyone involved before word got out that they were being investigated, wanted to flip Dante against Chen in exchange for a reduced sentence that would still involve significant prison time. The meeting with the FBI agents happened in Marcus's office. Three serious individuals in suits that screamed federal law enforcement, asking questions with the kind of intensity that made it clear they knew exactly what they were doing and didn't tolerate bullshit. I walked them through everything: my purchase of the property, the gift to my parents, Dante's takeover, and the forged documents, every detail I could remember that might be useful. They recorded my statement, took copies of all my documentation, assured me that they'd move quickly to protect my parents and secure the property before Chen or Dante could complete the sale, or worse, disappear with money that didn't belong to them. What happened next unfolded with the speed and precision of a coordinated strike. Federal agents executing search warrants simultaneously at Chen's offices, Dante's house in the Hamptons, the Lakehouse, and half a dozen other locations connected to the conspiracy. I wasn't there for most of it, Marcus advising me to stay away to avoid any suggestion that I'd interfered with the investigation, but Tommy fed me updates as they came in, his voice tight with satisfaction as he described agents seizing computers and files, making arrests, dismantling an operation that had been running for years. The call I'd been waiting for came that evening, Marcus's voice carrying relief and something deeper, something like justice being served after too long waiting. The FBI had arrested Chen and Dante simultaneously, had secured the Lakehouse's evidence in a criminal case, and had frozen all assets connected to the fraud, including the money Dante had borrowed against the property. My parents were being moved back into the main house under federal protection while the investigation continued, their nightmare finally ending even as the legal process was just beginning. I asked about Dante, whether he'd said anything, whether he'd shown any remorse or understanding of what he'd done to our family. Marcus's answer was short and devastating. Dante had immediately asked for a lawyer and tried to cut a deal offering to testify against Chen in exchange for immunity, showing no concern for our parents or acknowledgement that he'd done anything wrong beyond getting caught. I drove upstate that night, unable to wait until morning, needing to see my parents in their home, needing to witness with my own eyes that they were okay. The property was surrounded by federal vehicles, agents still processing evidence, but they let me through after verifying my identity. The front door was unlocked, and when I walked inside, I found my mother sitting in the living room on furniture that wasn't hers, surrounded by evidence tags and the remnants of Dante's failed scheme. She looked up when I entered, and the expression on her face broke something in me that I didn't know could break. A mix of relief and grief so profound that words felt inadequate to contain it. My father was on the deck, standing at the railing looking out at the lake, and when I joined him, he didn't say anything at first, just reached over and took my hand in his rough, work-worn grip. We stood there in silence, watching the sun set over water that looked like liquid gold. And finally he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of everything that had happened. He said he'd always known Dante had problems, had always suspected his younger son cared more about appearances than substance, but he'd never imagined it would come to this, never thought his own child would be capable of such calculated cruelty. He said it felt like a death, losing Dante to his own greed, and in some ways it was worse than death, because Dante was still alive somewhere, still breathing, still existing, but no longer the person they'd raised and loved. The legal process that followed took months, a grinding, bureaucratic machine that moved with frustrating slowness, despite the overwhelming evidence of guilt. Dante tried multiple times to cut deals, to reduce his sentence, to find some way out of the consequences of his actions. He gave up Chen completely, testified about the money laundering operation with the detailed knowledge of someone who'd been intimately involved, But the prosecutors weren't interested in letting him walk away. The fraud he'd committed against our family was just one piece of a much larger conspiracy. And the federal guidelines for the charges he faced meant significant prison time, regardless of his cooperation. Chen's trial was a media spectacle. News coverage that detailed the scope of his operation and the dozens of people he'd victimized in his pursuit of profit. Dante testified against him, wearing an orange jumpsuit and wrist shackles, looking smaller, somehow, than I remembered, diminished by the weight of his choices. I attended every day of the trial, sitting in the gallery, watching my brother describe in clinical detail how they'd planned to steal from our parents, how they'd forged documents and manipulated systems and treated human beings like obstacles to profit. Veronica sat on the other side of the courtroom, having cut a deal to testify against both of them in exchange for probation. Her influencer lifestyle destroyed, her social media accounts deleted, her designer clothes replaced with courtroom-appropriate outfits that screamed cheap lawyer. The verdicts came down on a Thursday afternoon in late October, almost a year after I had given my parents the keys to what should have been their dream retirement. Chen got 23 years in federal prison, effectively a life sentence for a man in his 60s who thought himself untouchable. Dante got 8 years, a sentence that felt simultaneously too long and not long enough. Punishment that would take him through his 40s and into his 50s. Time he'd spend in a cage thinking about the choices that led him there. The judge's statement during sentencing was scathing, talking about how family bonds were supposed to be sacred, how the betrayal of elderly parents for personal gain represented a fundamental failure of human decency, how the court had no sympathy for someone who'd traded love for money and lost both in the process.
My parents didn't attend the sentencing, couldn't bring themselves to watch their son be formally condemned. But I went because I needed closure, needed to see justice delivered, even though I knew it wouldn't undo the damage that had been done. When the judge announced the sentence and Dante was led away in chains, he looked back at me one final time. And I couldn't read his expression, couldn't tell if he felt remorse or just regret at being caught, couldn't see any evidence of the brother I'd once known in the stranger wearing his face. The Lakehouse was returned to my parents through a court order that cleared the forged deed and restored the original documentation showing my ownership and subsequent gift to them. The FBI had cataloged everything Dante had changed, had documented the renovations and the stolen furniture and the professional decorating that had transformed their home into a showcase property, but they didn't require returning everything to its original state. My parents decided to keep some of the improvements, the updated kitchen and the refinished floors, but they got rid of Dante's furniture, donated the expensive art to charity auctions, stripped away everything that reminded them of his betrayal, until the house felt like theirs again. I helped them move their belongings back in from the garage apartment, carrying boxes upstairs I'd climbed a year ago with such different emotions, arranging furniture in rooms that had been crime scenes and were now becoming home again. My mother set up her reading nook exactly as I'd originally designed it, filling the shelves with books she'd been collecting, claiming the space that had been taken from her. My father went fishing from the dock, standing in the same spot where he'd stood that sunset evening when everything was falling apart, reclaiming the piece that had been stolen. But something had changed fundamentally, something that couldn't be restored through court orders or prison sentences or time passing. The innocence was gone, the ability to trust without question, the belief that family meant unconditional loyalty and love. My parents had learned the hard way that blood doesn't guarantee goodness, that the people closest to you can hurt you worse than strangers ever could, that sometimes the monsters wear familiar faces and sleep in rooms down the hall. They still lived in the Lakehouse, still enjoyed the sunsets and the garden and the life I'd tried to give them.
But there was a sadness underneath now, a grief for the son they'd lost, not to death, but to his own choices. Dante wrote letters from prison, attempts at apology that arrived with depressing regularity. Pages filled with excuses and justifications, and requests for forgiveness that he hadn't earned and might never earn. My parents read the first few, then stopped opening them, kept them in a box in the closet like evidence of something they couldn't quite name. He'd be eligible for parole in 5 years if he behaved himself, could potentially be released early for good behavior and cooperation, could someday walk out of prison and back into a world that had moved on without him. The question of what would happen then, whether reconciliation was possible or even desirable, hung over everything like storm clouds that never quite broke into rain. I visited the Lakehouse often that first year after the trial. Weekends and holidays, making up for lost time and trying to fill the space Dante had left in our family structure. My mother started smiling again, real smiles that reached her eyes, and my father's shoulders unbent from the weight of shame that wasn't his to carry. They made friends with neighbors, joined community groups, built a life in the town that was finally theirs without qualification or fear. But I noticed how they locked doors now, even during the day. How my mother checked and rechecked paperwork compulsively. How my father seemed uncomfortable with unexpected visitors. Small ways that trauma had rewritten their responses to the world. The lawsuit against the corrupt notary who'd stamped the forged documents resulted in a settlement that would help cover the legal fees Marcus had charged at a substantial discount, but not free, because even friends have bills to pay. Tommy Rizzuto became someone I stayed in touch with, calling occasionally to check in or ask advice about security measures for my parents, developing a friendship based on mutual respect and shared experience of fighting through something difficult. James Sullivan reached out after reading about the case in the news, offered congratulations, and suggested we grab coffee sometime to properly mend the bridge we'd burned years ago over something that seemed trivial now in comparison to real betrayal. The tech consulting career I'd built suffered during those months of investigation and trial. Clients I'd McRected who moved on to other consultants. Deals that fell through because I couldn't give them the attention they required. But I discovered I didn't care as much as I'd expected. Found that the metrics I'd used to measure success, the money and the status and the professional recognition, felt hollow compared to what I'd learned about what actually mattered. I started taking fewer clients, being more selective about projects, making time for my parents in ways I'd never prioritized before because I'd thought there would always be time later, not understanding how quickly later could be stolen. Veronica divorced Dante while he was awaiting trial, a process that was mercifully quick because they'd signed a prenup and had no children, and nothing worth fighting over except debt. She disappeared from social media completely, apparently moved to California to start over somewhere nobody knew her story, trying to rebuild a life from the wreckage of choices she'd participated in, if not initiated. I felt no sympathy for her. Remembered too clearly how she'd laughed in my mother's face, how she treated my parents like servants in their own home, how she'd been complicit in every part of the fraud, even if she'd ultimately tried to save herself by testifying. The moral of this nightmare, if there was one to be extracted from so much pain, revealed itself slowly over those months of recovery and rebuilding. I'd spent my entire adult life believing that success meant money and career achievement, that providing financially was the highest form of love I could offer my parents, and that the Lakehouse represented the ultimate gift because of its price tag and luxury amenities. But what they'd needed more than an expensive house was protection, vigilance, someone paying attention to warning signs that I'd been too busy to notice. I'd given them a palace and inadvertently painted a target on their backs, attracting the kind of predatory greed that saw opportunity in their vulnerability. The harder truth, the one that kept me awake some nights, was that I'd enabled Dante in some ways without realizing it, had set up a situation where he felt entitled to what I'd earned, resentful of my success, convinced that he deserved a share of wealth he hadn't worked for. The Thanksgiving dinner where I'd given my parents the keys had also been the moment when Dante's envy crystallized into action, when seeing what I could afford made him realize how far behind he'd fallen, how his luxury lifestyle was built on debt and appearances, while mine was built on actual achievement. I hadn't intended to humiliate him, had genuinely just wanted to do something wonderful for our parents. But impact matters more than intent, and the impact had been to trigger a spiral of criminal behavior that destroyed our family. My father, in one of our sunset deck conversations that became a regular ritual, offered a different perspective that I carried with me like a talisman against self-blame. He said that Dante's choices were Dante's responsibility, that nobody forced him to commit fraud or steal or betray his family, that blaming myself for his failures was giving him too much power and me too little credit. He said the gift of the Lakehouse was still the most beautiful thing anyone had ever done for them, that the months of peace they'd had before Dante showed up were precious beyond price, that they wouldn't trade the experience of living there even with all of the pain that followed because it taught them something important about resilience and love and what truly matters. My mother added her own wisdom, born from years of cleaning houses for people who treated her as invisible, said that watching me fight for them, seeing me refuse to accept injustice, knowing that I'd risked everything to restore what had been stolen, meant more to her than any physical property ever could. She said the lake house was just a building, wood and glass and stone, but family was supposed to be something more enduring, and now she knew which of her children understood that difference. The forgiveness in her words was complete and unconditional, even though I still struggle to forgive myself for not protecting them better, for not seeing what Dante was capable of until it was too late. The question of whether I'd eventually forgive Dante remained unanswered, possibly unanswerable, something I'd have to figure out over years rather than months. Marcus suggested that forgiveness wasn't the same as reconciliation, that I could forgive him for my own peace while still maintaining boundaries that protected me and my parents from future harm. Tommy was less philosophical, said some betrayals were too fundamental to move past, that trust once shattered couldn't be repaired no matter how much time passed or how sincere the apologies seemed. Both perspectives had merit, and I suspected the truth would end up somewhere in the complicated space between them. What I knew for certain was that I'd changed through this experience, been forged in the fire of family betrayal into someone harder, but also more clear-eyed about what mattered and what didn't. The career success I'd chased so obsessively felt less important now, a means to an end rather than an end in itself. The relationships I'd neglected in pursuit of professional achievement suddenly seemed precious and finite, requiring attention and care and presence that I could no longer take for granted. The naive belief that family bonds were unbreakable had been destroyed, replaced with the more mature understanding that relationships require constant choosing, that love is a verb that demands action, and that people can fail each other in catastrophic ways if they stop trying. There were moments, usually late at night when I couldn't sleep, when I'd wonder about alternate timelines, paths not taken, choices that might have led to different outcomes. What if I'd never bought the lake house, had given my parents something smaller and less valuable, something that wouldn't have attracted Dante's predatory attention? What if I'd paid more attention to the warning signs, had noticed sooner that something was wrong, had intervened before they'd been living in a garage apartment for weeks? What if I'd been a better sister to Dante, had helped him when his business was struggling instead of being too busy with my own career, had prevented the desperation that made fraud seem like a viable option? But those questions led nowhere useful, down rabbit holes of speculation that couldn't change what had actually happened. The reality was that Dante had made his choices, had prioritized greed over love, had treated our parents as obstacles rather than the people who'd sacrificed everything for us, and those choices had consequences that no amount of regret could undo. My responsibility wasn't to carry guilt for his failures, but to learn from what happened, to be better moving forward, to protect my parents and build the kind of family relationship that was worth protecting. The Lakehouse itself became a symbol of something more complex than I'd intended when I bought it. Not just a gift, but a testament to survival. Not just a home, but a reminder that love requires vigilance. Not just a place, but a lesson in what happens when greed encounters goodness. My parents thrived there eventually, made it truly theirs in ways that transcended ownership documents or legal battles, filled it with memories that had nothing to do with Dante or his betrayal. I'd watch them sometimes, my mother reading in her nook with afternoon sun streaming through windows, my father on the dock with a fishing line in the water, and I'd feel this fierce protective love that was different from what I'd felt before, sharper and more deliberate, conscious choice rather than automatic assumption. The media coverage of the trial brought unexpected attention. Reporters calling for interviews about the family fraud case, producers wanting to turn it into a documentary or made-for-TV movie that would exploit our pain for entertainment. I declined everything, issued a statement through Marcus asking for privacy, refusing to let our story become content for people who hadn't lived through the devastation of watching family destroy itself from within. Some stories aren't meant to be shared with strangers. Some pain is too personal to put on display. And I'd learned enough about boundaries to enforce them even when it would have been easier to just say yes. Chen's conviction opened up investigations into other properties and deals. Victims coming forward who'd been targeted by his operation, families who'd lost homes or savings to his schemes. The scope of the damage he'd caused over decades was staggering. Lives ruined and service to greed that knew no limits. People who trusted him because he seemed legitimate and professional and successful. Our case became part of a larger pattern, evidence in a system that protected predators and punished the vulnerable, a reminder that justice delayed is often justice denied, and that fighting back matters even when the odds seem impossible. As months turned into a year and then toward a second year, the rawness of the betrayal began to scab over, not healed, but at least not bleeding constantly. My parents mentioned Dante less frequently, stopped wondering what they'd done wrong to raise a son capable of such cruelty, started accepting that sometimes people make choices that have nothing to do with how they were raised and everything to do with character flaws they were born with or developed along the way. Thanksgiving came around again, the holiday when I'd given them the keys, and we celebrated quietly at the Lakehouse, just the three of us, acknowledging the absence without letting it dominate the day. I thought about Dante in prison, wondered if he was reflecting on what he'd lost, whether the money had been worth destroying his relationship with everyone who'd ever loved him, if he lay awake at night feeling remorse or just resentment at being caught. The letters kept coming, though my parents still didn't read them, and I couldn't bring myself to open them either, not ready to hear whatever justifications or apologies he thought would make a difference. Maybe someday I'd be strong enough to read them, to try to understand what had broken in him that made theft from families seem acceptable, but that day hadn't arrived yet, and might never arrive. The lesson I took from all of it, the truth that emerged from the wreckage of our family, was simple and devastating in its clarity. Money can't buy love, but it can definitely reveal the absence of it. The Lakehouse hadn't created Dante's greed, it had just exposed what was already there, waiting for an opportunity. My success hadn't caused his failure, but it had highlighted the difference in our character and work ethic and values. The gift I'd given my parents hadn't invited betrayal, but it had revealed who among their children understood what family actually meant, beyond genetic connection. And in the end, standing on the deck of the Lakehouse, watching another sunset paint the sky in impossible colors, surrounded by parents who'd survived their son's betrayal and emerged somehow stronger for it, I understood that the real gift wasn't the property, or the luxury, or the financial security. The real gift was learning who you could count on when everything fell apart, who would fight for you when you couldn't fight for yourself, who understood that love was measured in presence and protection rather than price tags and prestige. My parents had always known that, had lived it through decades of sacrifice, and maybe the whole nightmare had been necessary to teach me what they'd always understood. The moral carved itself into my bones through pain and persistence. The greatest inheritance you can give or receive isn't property or money, but integrity that can't be bought and loyalty that can't be broken. Because in the end, when everything else is stripped away, when the houses and the cars and the bank accounts disappear, all that remains is whether you chose love over greed, family over fortune, and doing right over doing well. Dante made his choice, and so did I.